warm welcome back to this edition of the CGMA Management Accounting Series. And still with me in studio, I have Beth McGuinness from IQ Business, Lee Knight from Accenture Digital South Africa, Johan Pretorius from MTN, Philip Hatting from PwC Sub-Saharan Africa, and Werner Swanepoel from Deloitte Analytics Africa. Well, just before the ad break, we did delve into the element with regard to execution. And this naturally brings us to the important element and ever-increasing role that those within financial services or the financial division of institutions play a critical role in leading the direction and steering the ship strategically and otherwise of these organizations. Coming back to management accountants, and I'm happy for you to make reference to those who are in your institutions regarding the level of thinking and adaptation, using the human element here, and most importantly, executing on some of the analysis that they've made. Is this a theme that is rising within the organizations that you see internally? Let's start with you, Philip.
I think the level of adoption is definitely increasing in terms of organizations where you're seeing analytics capabilities being established within finance functions in itself. I think in terms of if we look at financial reporting and management accounts, in many instances being one-directional, it needs to start looking at the broader ecosystems in terms of aspects of sustainability and all of that. So I think there's still a long way to go, but it's also in terms of the information that's being presented, how much is it aligned to the strategic objectives of the organization, and are we actually reporting in alignment to that key decisions can be made. So that's not just purely financial, but it's actually looking at the broader performance criteria of the organization.
Lee, you wanted to add, Beth? Or Lee?
Right. So I guess if you look back at management accountants, before we change to the new way of working, something's got to give. And one of the things we talk about is integrated business services. So we talk about transactional back office services. And there's clearly a need to move away from a language that accountants understand to a language that business understands. And integrated business services is a way to serve up knowledge and insights to business in a way that is understood. Earlier we spoke about a common language framework. In many regards, if accountants can't talk to the business, we don't have a common language to take us forward. So in many regards, if we don't adopt some of these newer ways of working, we can't free up ourselves to drive these new insights. So that's an important point. The second thing is, once you've got these integrated business services or transactional services in play, then you can start to have the management accountant try out new things. But ultimately, the management accountant as we go forward will be Mr. Analytics, in my view, be Mr. Control Tower, Miss Control Tower, which almost has the opportunity to guide the direction of the organization. Now, there will be a battle going on between the CFO, CMO, COO as to who controls the leadership. In my opinion, the CFO, the management accountant, has a very clear role into steering the organization. We come from understanding insights, and as Philip says, we always knew the numbers. But if we add the business context, suddenly we're well positioned to steer or add steerage to the organization as we go forward.
On that note, though, I do also want us to get commentary with regard to the ever-growing role and importance of the Chief Financial Officer within institutions. And in a moment, we will be getting representation from Mr. John Wendell, who joins us as the Global Chief Financial Officer of CIMA. So we will get your perspective very briefly. But on that element, you say that we shouldn't just communicate in numbers from a management accountant's point of view. Then how do we need to ensure that they go from speaking accounting to speaking business? And can we measure and set a standard perhaps for the method in which they communicate, which hopefully will be more than just spreadsheets?
So I think one of the things that we are definitely seeing in the way that the information is actually presented back is, first off, if you go back, accounting packs are big, they're complicated. There's a lot of individual pieces of information that are shared on those reports. What we're really starting to see is people are looking at the information they're getting and saying, how do we simplify it? When I get this 100-page pack that tells me all of my numbers across the organization, which 5 am I using to actually guide my decisions? And you're seeing organizations really streamlining the number of factors that they use to make decisions on, and actually throwing away a lot of the less relevant sets of information so that they can focus on key metrics that are commonly understood across your accounting team as well as across your finance team. And they may be quite complicated in the way that they've sourced information from multiple different sources, but the key decisions are being made by 5, maybe 6 different levers in most of your organizations. And the focus becomes on picking the right levers that are actually changing the direction of your business versus what is just an irrelevant shift in temporary temporary numbers.
Philip?
I think we're seeing more and more highly effective finance functions are moving towards business partner models where they, in essence, taking out management accountant or an accountant in order to work with business and engage with business in terms of the insights. What that requires for them to challenge across the supply chain, it's not just about the financial metric, it's actually how does all of these other operational metric then feeds into financial result. And that's quite a critical role. Within that finance business partner role, it is to create value through that engagement with business. So it's not just the one-dimensional aspect, but it's actually working with business in order to derive the value from that level of engagement.
Going back to that, again, does it mean that perhaps management accountants need to ask the right questions? Are they asking the right questions firstly? Do they need to ask them differently perhaps? And is it sector specific? Because I'd imagine for a FMCG firm versus a telecoms operator or financial services institution, the objectives and end game is actually quite different.
Yeah.
Johan, before we come to Werner for an opinion?
Yes, I think it is what questions we're asking that drives the answers we get. And I think it's also, instead of basing the questions on your experience and your background and your bias, to rather ask more open-ended questions which could lead to the insights. So instead of just asking why is this number what it is or what changed from last month, it's more around we've noticed a change, what could have influenced it, what can we do to change it going forward. So I think it's asking broader questions.
Werner, would you agree before we come to Lee?
Yeah, but I think, firstly, I think for the management accountant, it's a hugely exciting time because the world that's changing is creating opportunities for the profession to start to play a fundamentally different role, which leads to a number of the questions in terms of do we need a new skill set? Do we need a different frame of mind? Do we? So the question around do we need industry-specific expertise? Absolutely. Because as the management accountant asking those questions, those open-ended questions, and we often refer to them as crunchy questions. It's not about the mundane questions. It's about asking those really crunchy questions. One of the biggest challenges is you need a combination of skills. You need a combination of capabilities. So not only do you need the finance skill, not only do you need the ability to crunch the numbers, not only do you need the ability to present it in some meaningful format, you certainly also need the business context and the experience of how the business works. Now, as a management accountant, you are ideally positioned to really see the big picture and really start to influence the thinking and the way that the organization goes about dealing with information. But you will not succeed if you do not start to develop those multifaceted skills, the business insight, the analytical experience, because you also need to be able to analyze the data and then the ability to actually work with the data and the tools that are available.
So those are the elements you'd want on the CV of a management accountant that you would have to hire.
Most definitely.
And I think, to build on that point and to go back to a point you made earlier about how it's also about what skills do you need to unlearn to do it. I think one of the things that Excel, which is by far the most common way of sharing information around an organization, has unfortunately taught people is that information is flat, it's two-dimensional. You have your rows, you have your columns, and you can put the odd pivot on it, but fundamentally you are limited to those two dimensions in the way that you understand and interpret your information. It's about unlearning that flat world that exists within the Excel environment and starting to look at, well, what can we do by bringing in some of these analytical engines that create the n-dimensional structure of bringing in those additional factors, bringing in information from externally, bringing in your behavioral and your operational metrics, your customer trends. So what trends are happening in your customer markets and your competitors? How do you make all of that information available and really the flat structures that I think people have been used to receiving their information in start falling flat within that. So they have to break that heavy reliance on those spreadsheets.
An open question to each of you. Do you have a direct relationship, a working relationship with your management accountants within your entities, which results in not only an open exchange of information, but execution of the results of these findings?
Absolutely. In my organization, we've seen the accountants take a lot more time to learn the business. Now, before you acquire new skills, can you understand the language that I talk as a business leader? So I've seen a clear move from accountants to learn the language of the business. So as Beth said, to give it flavor and to give it the crunchiness that Werner alluded to, let's talk the right language. And I see a lot more conversations, less about the numbers. And like Beth said earlier, choose the 4 or 5 key metrics and then have the conversation on what to do about those metrics. So I think I've seen a clear evolution. I do want to make a point, it does sound a little bit crazy, but I see the finance function evolving. I will see more analytics people for sure, but I'll see people that do psychology, people that understand the psychography of the human mind, design thinking skills. Suddenly you have a whole team that doesn't feel like accounting in the accounting function.
On that note, I'd like us to get that perspective from the Global Chief Financial Officer of CMA. I do understand you don't have a mic, sir, but I do understand it is making its way to you. Right behind you, that's Mr. John Wendell, who's joining us from London, came into South Africa. I hope the weather's been treating you well. But on a separate note, we're talking about these financial leaders in the future, and as you hear, analytical thinkers, psychology perhaps being thrown in there, but a different method to the thinking which is required to the ever-evolving role of chief financial officers in the future. What's your observation on this, especially given the fact that you come from a global perspective where you can give us a view on how the landscape is changing and if it is evolving fast enough, especially in emerging markets like South Africa?
I could sort of start by reiterating everything the panel said, because the insights that you have given us are really top of mind and very much part of the CFO's life and the things that he or she is thinking about. Really, the CFO as a member of the board, whilst historically control frameworks and control structures have been a significant part of the role, what is very much now at the forefront is perhaps the chief investment officer side of the role. So it's the person who is working with the board in the development of their strategy, but also in the way that it's deployed and the way that resources are allocated to the strategic objectives and initiatives that the board is wanting to pursue. And then through performance management and through the data and the analytics, being able to guide and direct the board as to where the biggest bang for the buck is, where the best return is. And the return clearly comes from customers. So knowing your customers and knowing from the customer right through the organization what's going on and what needs to happen gives you then the basis upon which to advise and to guide and to make the right decisions. And so increasingly the CFO, the management accountant, as the panel has said, needs to not only fully understand the business throughout the whole value chain of the business, but to also be able to understand which parts of the data, the analytics, the information are relevant to making the right decisions.
On that note, you mentioned something quite critical, and thank you so much for sharing your feedback with us and joining us today. I want to, Werner, you mentioned execution. And as John has alluded to, we need to see the results, and naturally that's translated in the customer base or end user which we serve. From your independent institutions, where you've taken the feedback of the management accountant, you've executed some of the suggestions that have been implemented, have we seen a direct correlation between adequate analysis of the data translating into a better end use for the consumer, and as a result, increased financial performance of the entity you serve? Philip?
Yeah, I think one of the comments raised was specifically in terms of long-term capital investments, which is obviously with a changing landscape actually quite critical, that you need to understand how that's going to evolve over time before you make that investment. So we've certainly seen where we've actually enhanced that decision-making process by leveraging off analytics to project a bit more in terms of how certain dynamics are going to change, that we can not just only inform it at a decision-making point, but actually evaluate it through the journey of that project as well, and then towards the outcome. And then you can start measuring that from an ROI perspective in terms of return. So I think that's the good part of having data and analytics, is that you can actually, through the journey, keep on evaluating the outcomes that are being achieved.
Exactly.
And I think that that's one of the really key points that comes out of that as well. Is one of the key concepts about Agile is if you are going to fail fast. So not only using analytics to help inform your decision, but use them as well to decide when do you need to backtrack, making sure that information is always available. So right at the point of making the decision, you have to decide how are you going to be measuring it, even in the very early stages, so that if it does turn out to be a less than optimal decision, you can quickly readjust and refocus your business and perhaps get the best benefit out of the decisions you've made.
Guguletu, it's probably worth noting that we should be clear that the CFO, the management accountant, isn't going to solve these crises by themselves. They've got a partner for success. So in many regards, having quantitative insights is really important. But what we find in the analytics world is combining that with the human emotion and understand the customer and the products we take to market is equally as important. So yes, we can understand the data from an insight and an inside perspective. When you combine it with the customer or the citizen perspective, suddenly we're able to change and evolve our business to drive our relevance. And it's an important point because if you aren't using insights to change your strategy, by combining what you do now and what you need to do, you'll never evolve to drive your relevance.
Very true. Well, we do have about 10 more minutes before we do wrap up the conversation, and I do understand that we'll take questions from the floor. I've gotten direction that we'll take one question at a time, so I understand the microphone is with you, ma'am. If you could please share your name and title with us and the organization you're representing and pose your question to the panel.
Good day, I'm Vivian Erasmus, COO of CMA Incorporated, an auditing firm. One of the key things that all of us have learned at university is relevance of data. How do we get our millennials, who is absolutely amazing at getting the data, but how do we get them to realize what is relevant for today and for now, especially in the range of organizations that we have? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. The microphone will move on to the next speaker. Anyone open to addressing that question?
I think, to go back down to there are certain things that data you can tell what the correlations are. So you can understand exactly how your information is correlated and how it's moving things. But when it comes to actually interpreting what are the causations and how do you know what information to trust, I think that's when some of the years under the belt actually start helping. So it takes time. I think most people will say that some of the biggest learnings they've ever had have been from making mistakes, not from getting it right. So perhaps the best way for the millennials to learn is to give them a little bit of freedom to fail. But to fail in a safe environment, fail fast, and then from there they can take it and eventually they will learn what is a correlation, what is a causation, and how to take more appropriate actions.
I think, from my end, how I normally challenge my team is basically two things. Number one is what is the hypothesis? And even if we solve that hypothesis, what is the outcome? What is the value? And then you start driving it back into what data, what, tools, analytical methods you use and apply in order to derive that.
It's important to recognize that millennials coming out of university won't have all the answers. So like Werner and Philip have said, give them a safe environment to learn, to tinker, not just to fail, but to work alongside more seasoned professionals. We assume too much and expect too much sometimes. Give them a room to bring the creativity they bring as millennials with Gen X, as Werner mentioned earlier. When you bring these things together, you'll have a lot more value.
Indeed. So increased partnerships again being highlighted here in the conversation. We're happy to take your question, sir. If you could please tell us which organization you're from.
Strategic Implementation Advisor and Executive Coach for Ethos Predictive Intelligence. As you can gather from my background, this is a hot subject for me and I hopefully make a lot of money out of it. But one of the things that I've come across in my travels globally as ex-president of CIMA is this human element, and I think this is really critical. Management accountants do not sit behind a desk analysing numbers any longer. They have got to be out there in the operations. They're the eyes and ears and finance in the business itself. And I'm glad I heard the word business model. If you want to really go at this game, you have to understand the business model. And it's not the same in most industries. I've worked in almost every sector of industry, public and private. And it really is that human element. Management accountants are a different breed in themselves. Finance functions are not shrinking. They are staying the same, they're just dispersing out there in the business. Real-time analytics. This is also another hotspot. What is your view on real-time analytics?
Thank you so much for your question, sir.
So I think the real-time analytics world is rapidly evolving, and it links to a number of the comments Lee's made before as well. So we're absolutely moving at a much more rapid pace nowadays. We use the term right-time analytics rather than real-time, because not every requirement is a real-time requirement. It's absolutely about having the right information at the right time. Now, having said that, there are certainly areas of businesses and some industries more than others where real-time analytics can have a fundamental impact and be of significant value to the business. And where those business problems exist, where real-time information and real-time analytics will have the ability, we certainly see an evolution towards that. More and more capabilities. The technologies are certainly also evolving to enable that. The question I would always ask is, in a real-time world, you will be gathering significant volumes of data. Do you know what to do with that? Do you know how to treat that? And it comes back to that same old question. It's the so what question. So what will I do with it once I have it? And if you have the ability to respond in real time, then absolutely go for real-time analytics.
I agree. One of the key things we didn't talk about today is something called IoT, the Internet of Things. And the reality is that we are able to tap into sensors in our personal life, whether it's a Pebble or an Apple Watch, as well as sensors in equipment and the plants that we run in our organizations. And like Werner has rightly said, what is the question, what is the KPI you need information on? Now, the one thing about real-time analytics worth noting is that your ability to tap into real-time analytics is a lot easier than it was 10 years ago. It's because industry has come to the party and provided these big infrastructures to make it possible. So once again, it comes to the point of partnerships. Are we partnering with the right organizations to access their balance sheets, access their expertise? Because we've got the problem, but how do we solve it? And my experience most recently was when they partner, you're able to get close to real-time analytics or right-time analytics than you ever have, only if you partner.
We'll take one more question from the floor and then get perspective from our panel of experts. You can go ahead, sir.
I'm Francois de Toy. I'm interested in the role of the CFO in high-level strategy, especially corporate strategy. A lot of the insights are gained in collecting the data and analyzing the data, but the decision doesn't reside at the collection levels. It resides higher up. How do you suggest we transfer those insights from the management levels that collect and analyze the data to the senior corporate levels where these decisions are then actually made? Because that's where the insight is important.
Thank you so much for your question, sir. Anyone keen to respond?
Well, from my perspective, one of the things I've seen happen most recently is CFOs stepping up and saying, I want to be on that ExCo and I want to share my perspective in that common language. So I think the point you made earlier today was that accountants have an ability to give us a good perspective if they understand the common language. So I think every one of us, whether we're the CIO, CMO or CFO, are equally able to do it. It's the language we talk about. Ultimately, for you to get recognition at an ExCo or a board, you've got to talk the right language and in the quickest amount of time possible. So I think CFOs and management accountants generally are all able to. They should get the language right and put the effort into learn the language that the board speaks.
I would like to add to that in that, so I think many CFOs are now actually starting to take the lead. So it's no longer about a person collecting and analyzing the data and then having to communicate that upwards. We often see that it's actually starting to change and being pushed downwards. So CFOs taking the lead, saying, I need the insight, I need this analysis to be done, and often they do it themselves. So, and I think as the millennials move through, we will see more and more CFOs having the ability to be much more hands-on. At the same time, one of the biggest frustrations of this so-called species data scientists, that Harvard called this the sexiest job of the 21st century, is when we employ these very capable and very expensive resources, but we don't open up the channels. So they come up with the most amazing insights, but the channels aren't created for them to action those insights. And that's one of the single biggest frustrations, is the inability to action, the inability to execute. So it's certainly in the interest of the CFO and every other executive in the organization, if they're serious about insights and analytics, to open those channels and make sure that there's a free flow of insights and ideas and the ability to execute.
And I think, in addition to the data scientists who have all of that insight, I think it's very important for the CFOs to start looking at what is your data lineage, where is your information coming from, what rules are being made and what changes are being made to that data as it moves through your organization. Because it is correct, a lot of the decisions are made at that level, and I think what is probably what keeps most of the CFOs up at night is where do you have a developer somewhere who's making a decision on what data to include in an extract that is having a significant impact on the numbers on the other side when they pop out of the chain, and how do you make those decisions that are being made across really what can be quite a long value chain, how do you make them visible to the people that are using the end information as part of their decision making cycle?
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I think the agenda for the CFO is a lot about shareholder value and how you're going to, within the changing ecosystem where there's different forces impacting on that, is how you're going to start looking and measuring and you almost take that foresight view as to what is potentially going to impact, and that you can actually leverage analytics for. And it's engaging more in those conversations that I think is really where the value is going to sit for the CFO.
Perfect. I'm happy that you've responded adequately to the questions that have been posed by the audience. But as we do start to draw this conversation to a close and getting your closing remarks on some of the critical elements that are involved, a twofold question. One would assume that there must be a lot of capital investment required to implement some of these changes within organizations. Perhaps if we could address that, and more importantly, change doesn't necessarily take overnight or happen overnight, and the results might take a certain amount of period before they do translate into numbers or tangible customer experience or whichever metrics it is that the organizations are looking out for. Your closing remarks, incorporating these elements and other elements that we haven't touched on regarding the changing mindset and human element of chartered global management accountants. Werner, let's start with you.
So I would suggest one start small and find those specific opportunities in the business where the value is real and tangible, and essentially make your analytics road journey fund itself. And that is the winning recipe to execute ultimately, and it's certainly in the long term also the best possible way to secure the funding that you require.
Philip?
I think just linked to that is that organizations need to see it as that they need to be a data-enabled organization. They need to understand that data is an asset that they need to leverage in the right way, bring it to those key decision points, but then also have the culture to change with that and to leverage that. I think once that's done, and again the process could be that it's a step process, proving value as you continue, but it's critical that organizations need to start maturing from that perspective.
Johan?
Well, I fully agree. I think starting small will surely prove the point up front. But it's also a matter of companies, either they change or they stagnate. I don't think there's an option anymore. So either you're data enabled or your competitors will run you into the ground. So yeah.
Lee?
I think from a CapEx versus OpEx perspective, I think the CFO and the accountant has many more options than they've ever had before. People are willing to go out and risk and help you to fast track realization of value. So like you said earlier, the question was, how quickly does it take? It depends. Will you do it yourself? Will you build up skills you can't acquire today? Or will you partner with organizations that can do it much quicker? And many things today, you can do it much quicker if you partner. My final thought is something we call digital quotient. Does your leadership understand what digital is? So yes, we're talking about data and insights, but does that CEO really get it? And the question is, will the CFO take the time to educate the rest of the board or the exco on the power of data and insight? Because if you don't talk to them about the power of insight and show them why they should care, and they won't care. And if they don't care, then you'll never get the sponsorship you need to drive this point in execution.
Beth?
I think really what you're looking for, and I mean it has to go back to Werner's original point of start small. Don't try and boil the ocean and solve everybody's problems all at once. And focus on building small cross-functional teams that can move across various different areas of the organization that need a team to work on it and be able to pull together the various different technology, financial and business knowledge. Pull that all together and actually use it to deliver insights. And then once you've had those first small successes, allow them to become your champions to the rest of your organization. So slowly you start in the easy areas, build up to harder and more difficult cases to win over. So eventually you have business people convincing business people that this is the way to go, and accountants convincing accountants this is the way to go. You're not trying to sell them something from an external language. Use those success stories to prove your case and to increase your momentum.
Indeed. Thank you so much to each of our panelists for your phenomenal insight on the ever-evolving role of management accountants, and of course our audience as well for posing their questions and sharing their views with us today. Well, that's a wrap of this episode of the CGMA Management Accounting Series. A big thank you once more to my guests, Beth McGuinness, who's an Associate Partner at IQ Business, Lee Nike, Managing Director of Accenture Digital South Africa, Johan Pretorius, Business Intelligence Lead at MTN, Philip Hatting, Partner leading Data and Analytics for PwC Sub-Saharan Africa, and Werner Swanepoel, Director and Business Arena Leader, Deloitte Analytics Africa. From myself and the team, it's been a pleasure being with you today. Join us again next time.